The crisp morning air in Meadowbrook Estates was shattered by the sound of my phone buzzing at 6:15 a.m. Rancher Jake Sullivan had been living peacefully on his 5-acre property for 12 years, raising prize-winning Black Angus bulls and minding his own business. His barn, which housed his 3 magnificent bulls, Thunder, Maverick, and Beast, sat exactly 127 feet from his property line, well within county regulations for agricultural buildings. But this morning brought news that would change everything. The text message was from his neighbor, Carol Winters. "Jake, you need to see what's happening at your barn. The HOA is there with bolt cutters." Jake threw on his boots and raced across his property toward the large red barn that had been his pride and joy since inheriting the land from his grandfather. What he saw made his blood boil. 3 members of the Meadowbrook Estates Homeowners Association stood outside his barn. Patricia Blackwood, the self-appointed HOA president who had moved from the city just 2 years ago. Dennis Crawford, her loyal sidekick who seemed to live for writing violation notices. And Barbara Mills, the newest board member who carried a clipboard like it was a weapon. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" Jake demanded, noticing the fresh cut on his padlock hanging uselessly from the barn door. Patricia turned toward him with a smug expression that immediately set his teeth on edge. "Mr. Sullivan, we're conducting an inspection of unauthorized structures that violate our community standards. This barn is an eyesore that's bringing down property values throughout the neighborhood." Jake's fists clenched as he stared at the woman who had somehow convinced herself that she had authority over his family's century-old property. "Lady, this barn was here before your subdivision existed. My grandfather built it in 1952, and my family has legal agricultural rights that predate your precious HOA by 60 years. Dennis Crawford stepped forward with his clipboard, reading from what appeared to be a prepared statement. Section 4.7 of the Meadowbrook Estates Community Standards clearly states that all structures must maintain aesthetic harmony with the residential character of the neighborhood. This barn, with its peeling paint and agricultural odors, violates multiple provisions. The sheer audacity of these people examining his property without permission, while lecturing him about regulations that didn't apply to his grandfathered agricultural operation, left Jake speechless. Behind them, he could see his 3 bulls watching the commotion with mild interest, completely unaware that their home was under attack by suburban bureaucrats. "Get off my property," Jake said, his voice low and dangerous, "and don't ever cut my locks again, or we're going to have a much bigger problem than aesthetic harmony." Barbara Mills, apparently the designated record keeper, held up her phone and began filming. "Mr. Sullivan, we're documenting your hostile response to legitimate community oversight. This aggressive behavior toward elected HOA officials will be included in our formal complaint to the county." The irony of being called aggressive by people who had just committed breaking and entering on his property wasn't lost on Jake. As the 3 intruders finally departed, still muttering about legal action and community standards, Jake realized this was just the beginning of what promised to be a long and unpleasant conflict. What would you do if your HOA tried to claim authority over property they had no legal right to regulate? 2 weeks after the initial confrontation, Jake thought the HOA had given up their ridiculous crusade against his barn. He was wrong. Saturday morning arrived with the kind of perfect weather that made him grateful for his rural lifestyle, so he decided to drive into town for supplies and his weekly breakfast at Murphy's Diner. The trip should have taken 3 hours round trip, giving him time to cool off from the ongoing HOA harassment and enjoy some peace. When Jake returned home at noon, he discovered that peace was the last thing waiting for him. As he turned into his driveway, he could hear voices coming from inside his barn, along with what sounded like furniture being moved around. His first thought was that someone was stealing his equipment, but as he got closer, he realized the situation was far worse than simple theft. Patricia Blackwood's silver Lexus was parked beside his barn, along with Dennis Crawford's pristine white pickup truck and 2 other vehicles he didn't recognize. Through the open barn doors, Jake could see that the HOA had transformed his livestock facility into some kind of meeting space, complete with folding tables, chairs, and what appeared to be a full coffee service setup. "Are you kidding me?" Jake muttered, pulling out his phone to document what he was seeing. Patricia, Dennis, Barbara, and 4 other people he didn't recognize were sitting around a makeshift conference table in the center of his barn, papers spread out in front of them like they were conducting official business in his private property. As Jake approached, he could hear Patricia addressing the group with the authority of someone chairing a board meeting. As you can see, this structure has tremendous potential for community use. With proper renovation and management, we could transform this eyesore into a valuable community asset that benefits the entire neighborhood. If you're finding this incredible story as unbelievable as it sounds, please take a moment to subscribe to our channel and hit that like button. Stories like this prove that some people will stop at nothing to get what they want, and your support helps us share these jaw-dropping tales of property disputes gone wrong. Every subscription and like encourages us to keep bringing you real-life stories that are stranger than fiction. Jake stood in his own barn doorway, watching 7 people discuss his property like he didn't exist. The audacity was breathtaking. They had not only broken into his barn again, but were actually holding a planning meeting about how to steal it from him legally. "Excuse me," Jake said loudly, causing all conversation to stop. "This is private property, and y'all are trespassing. I need everyone to leave immediately." Patricia looked up with an expression of mild annoyance, as if Jake was interrupting something important. "Mr. Sullivan, we're conducting a feasibility study for the Community Improvement Initiative. This barn has been identified as a potential asset that could benefit the entire neighborhood if properly utilized." "The only thing this barn is going to be utilized for is housing my bulls," Jake replied, his patience wearing thin. "You broke into my property, you're trespassing, and you have about 30 seconds to pack up your stuff and get out before I call the sheriff." Dennis Crawford stood up with his typical bureaucratic swagger. "Actually, Mr. Sullivan, we have legal authority to inspect any structure that affects community property values. The county gave us permission to assess potential code violations." Jake pulled out his phone and dialed 911, but Patricia held up her hand with a smug smile. "Before you make that call, you should know that we've been in contact with the county planning department about rezoning this area for community use. Your agricultural exemption might not be as permanent as you think." The threat was clear. They were trying to steal his barn through legal manipulation, and they had just admitted it in front of witnesses. But Jake had a different plan for dealing with people who thought they could take what belonged to his family. "Y'all can sit here and plan all you want," Jake said, walking toward the back of the barn where the door led to his pasture. "But I think it's time you met the real owners of this property. Do you think Jake is making the right choice, or should he handle this situation differently?" Jake's 3 Black Angus bulls had been grazing peacefully in the back pasture when the commotion started. Thunder, the largest at 2,200 pounds, was the undisputed leader of the group. Maverick, slightly smaller but more energetic, served as Thunder's lieutenant. Beast, the youngest but still weighing in at 1,800 pounds, rounded out the trio that had been Jake's companions for the past 5 years. As Jake approached the pasture gate, the bulls looked up with the mild curiosity that characterized their daily routine. They were accustomed to Jake's presence and had learned to associate his arrival with feeding time or simply friendly visits. What they weren't accustomed to was having strangers invading their home while making loud noises and moving furniture around. "Boys," Jake said quietly as he reached for the gate latch, "we've got some uninvited guests who need to learn about property rights the hard way." Thunder lifted his massive head and snorted, as if he understood exactly what Jake was asking. These bulls had been raised on the Sullivan Ranch since they were calves, and while they were generally gentle animals, they were also protective of their territory and didn't appreciate disruptions to their routine. The gate swung open with a soft creak, and Jake stepped aside as 3 tons of Black Angus beef began moving toward the barn with the determined gait of animals investigating an unusual situation. Their hooves made soft drumming sounds on the hard-packed earth, growing louder as they approached the building where 7 people were still debating the future of their home. Inside the barn, Patricia was explaining her vision for converting the agricultural space into a community meeting facility when the first shadow appeared in the doorway. Thunder's massive form filled the entrance, his dark eyes scanning the scene with bovine curiosity. For a moment, the only sound was the shuffling of papers and the distant lowing of cattle. "Oh my God," whispered one of the visitors Jake didn't recognize. "Is that a real bull?" Before anyone could answer, Maverick appeared beside Thunder, followed quickly by Beast. 3 enormous animals now stood in the doorway, effectively blocking the only exit while studying the humans who had invaded their home. The contrast between the bulls' calm demeanor and the growing panic of the HOA members was almost comical. Patricia, apparently deciding that maintaining authority was more important than personal safety, stood up from her folding chair and pointed at the bulls like she was addressing unruly children. "Shoo! Get out of here! This is a meeting space now." Thunder, who had never been shooed by anyone in his life, took this as an invitation to investigate further. He stepped into the barn, his massive frame making the spacious building suddenly feel very small. The folding table that had seemed adequate for 7 people now appeared laughably insufficient as a barrier between humans and livestock. "Mr. Sullivan," Dennis Crawford called out, his voice cracking with panic. "Control your animals." Jake, who had positioned himself safely outside the barn, smiled for the first time in weeks. "They are controlled. They're doing exactly what bulls do when strangers invade their territory. Maybe y'all should have thought about that before breaking into their home." Maverick, apparently inspired by Thunder's boldness, wandered over to investigate the coffee service that had been set up on a side table. His massive head lowered toward the cups and pastries with the careful curiosity of an animal discovering something new and potentially edible. "He's going to knock everything over," Barbara Mills shrieked, climbing onto her folding chair like it would provide meaningful protection from a 2,000-pound animal. "Probably," Jake agreed cheerfully. "Bulls aren't really known for their table manners." Beast, not wanting to be left out of the investigation, approached the main table where the HOA's paperwork was spread out. His wet nose touched a stack of documents, leaving a trail of bovine slobber across what appeared to be zoning applications and legal briefs. The sight of their carefully prepared legal documents being investigated by a bull's nose was apparently the last straw for Patricia. "This is harassment. You can't just turn animals loose on people." "I didn't turn them loose," Jake replied calmly. "I opened the gate to their pasture, and they decided to come home. This is their barn, after all. What do you think will happen when these city folks realize they're trapped in a barn with 3 massive bulls?" The standoff that followed was unlike anything Jake had ever witnessed. 7 people huddled in the center of his barn while 3 massive bulls explored their territory with the methodical thoroughness of landlords inspecting their property. The initial panic had settled into nervous tension as the HOA members realized the bulls weren't actually aggressive, just curious and very, very large. Thunder had claimed the area near the main entrance, effectively cutting off the most obvious escape route. His massive body completely filled the doorway as he stood chewing thoughtfully on something he'd found near the coffee station. Maverick had discovered the paperwork and was now systematically investigating each document with his nose, leaving wet trails across legal briefs and zoning applications. Beast had positioned himself near the back wall, calmly observing the humans with the patient attention of an animal watching an interesting television program. "Mr. Sullivan," Patricia called out, trying to maintain some semblance of authority despite being trapped by livestock. "This has gone far enough. We demand that you remove these animals so we can leave." Jake Sullivan, who was enjoying the situation immensely, leaned against the barn door frame with his arms crossed. "Well, I suppose I could try to move them, but bulls are pretty independent creatures. They go where they want to go, when they want to go there." Dennis Crawford, who had climbed onto the makeshift conference table, looked around desperately for another exit. "There has to be another way out of here." "There's a window up in the loft," Jake offered helpfully. "Of course, it's about 15 feet off the ground, and you'd have to get past Maverick to reach the ladder." The window option was immediately dismissed when everyone looked up at the small opening near the barn's peak and realized it would require climbing skills none of them possessed. They were effectively trapped until the bulls decided to leave, and the bulls seemed perfectly content to stay right where they were. "This is kidnapping," Barbara Mills declared from her perch on the folding chair. "You're holding us against our will." "Actually," Jake corrected, "you're being held against your will by 3 bulls who don't appreciate strangers in their home. I'm just standing here watching property rights in action." The absurdity of the situation began to sink in as minutes stretched into an hour. 7 people dressed for a business meeting were trapped in a barn by livestock that showed no signs of leaving anytime soon. Thunder had found a pile of hay and was eating contentedly near the door. Maverick had knocked over the coffee service and was now investigating the spilled pastries on the floor. Beast continued his patient observation, occasionally snorting in what sounded suspiciously like amusement. "How long do they usually stay in here?" asked one of the visitors Jake didn't recognize. A middle-aged man in a business suit who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. "Depends," Jake replied thoughtfully. "Sometimes they come in to get out of the weather and stay for hours. Sometimes they just check things out and leave. Bulls keep their own schedule." Patricia, who had been silent for several minutes while presumably plotting her next move, suddenly stood up with renewed determination. "Fine. If you won't control your animals, we'll wait them out. This meeting is too important to be disrupted by livestock." She sat back down at the table, pulled out her phone, and began making notes as if 3 tons of Black Angus beef weren't currently sharing her meeting space. Now, where were we in the discussion about community asset utilization? The other HOA members stared at her in disbelief. Dennis Crawford, still standing on the table, gestured frantically at the bulls. "Patricia, we're trapped in here with dangerous animals." "They're not dangerous," Patricia replied, with the stubborn confidence of someone refusing to admit defeat. "They're just cows. We're not going to let farm animals dictate our community planning process." Jake had to admire her determination, even if he questioned her judgment. Watching 7 people try to conduct a formal meeting while surrounded by curious bulls was both entertaining and educational. The bulls were teaching these suburban invaders more about respect and boundaries in one afternoon than years of legal threats had accomplished. As the afternoon wore on, Jake settled in to wait. His bulls were comfortable, the trespassers were learning valuable lessons about property rights, and justice was being served by the most appropriate judges possible, the actual residents of the barn. "How long do you think it will take before the HOA members realize they're completely outmatched by 3 bulls and a determined rancher?" 3 hours into the standoff, the dynamics inside the barn had shifted considerably. The initial panic had given way to resigned acceptance, and the HOA members were discovering that sharing space with bulls required a level of humility they hadn't experienced in their suburban lives. Thunder had claimed the corner near the hay storage and was peacefully chewing while keeping one eye on the visitors. Maverick had finished investigating the spilled coffee and pastries and was now napping near the overturned table. Beast remained alert but calm, occasionally moving to investigate interesting sounds or smells. Patricia's determination to continue the meeting despite bovine oversight had gradually crumbled as the reality of her situation became undeniable. Her carefully styled hair was disheveled, her business suit wrinkled, and her authority had evaporated completely in the face of 3 animals who were utterly indifferent to her self-proclaimed importance. "Mr. Sullivan," she finally called out, her voice lacking its earlier confidence, "we understand your point. Perhaps we can discuss this situation more reasonably." Jagan, who had been leaning against the doorframe for the past hour enjoying the show, straightened up with interest. "What situation would that be, Mrs. Blackwood? The situation where you broke into my barn, or the situation where you're planning to steal my property through legal manipulation?" "We weren't stealing anything," Dennis Crawford protested from his position on the table. "We were conducting legitimate community research." "On private property," Jake reminded him, "without permission, using bolt cutters to break my locks. That's called breaking and entering where I come from." The man in the business suit, who had identified himself earlier as a county planning consultant, cleared his throat nervously. "Mr. Sullivan, I think there may have been some miscommunication about the scope of this project. I was told this was a voluntary community improvement initiative." Jake looked at the consultant with interest. "Voluntary? Did anyone mention that part to you, Mrs. Blackwood? Because it sounded like you were planning to force this through whether I cooperated or not." Patricia's face flushed red as she realized her hired consultant was learning about her deceptive tactics in real time. "The community good sometimes requires individual sacrifice," she said defensively. "The community good," Jake repeated slowly, "requires respect for property rights and following the law. Something y'all seem to have forgotten." Thunder chose that moment to stand up and stretch, his massive frame seeming to fill the entire barn. The movement reminded everyone exactly how powerless they were in this situation and how completely dependent they were on the bulls' continued good nature. "Look," Barbara Mills said desperately, We admit this got out of hand. Can't we just agree to leave and forget this whole thing happened? Jake considered the proposal while watching his bulls maintain their casual dominance over the situation. That depends. Are y'all planning to drop this community asset nonsense and leave my property alone? The consultant spoke up quickly. Mr. Sullivan, I can assure you that any county involvement in this project would require your voluntary participation. No one can force you to give up agricultural property rights. And the HOA? Jake asked, looking directly at Patricia. The silence stretched for several minutes before Patricia finally spoke. The HOA will pursue all legal avenues to ensure community standards are maintained. Jake nodded slowly. I figured that's what you'd say. Well, in that case, I think my bulls are pretty comfortable here. They might decide to stay for dinner, maybe breakfast tomorrow. You can't keep us here indefinitely, Dennis protested. I'm not keeping you anywhere, Jake replied. You're free to leave anytime you want. Just walk right past Thunder there and head on out. Everyone looked at Thunder, who had positioned himself directly in front of the barn door and was showing no signs of moving. The bull wasn't aggressive, but he was definitely occupying the exit with the casual authority of someone who belonged there. The resolution came from an unexpected source. Carol Winters, Jake's neighbor, who had texted him about the break-in, appeared in the doorway behind Thunder with Sheriff Deputy Rodriguez. The bull turned to investigate the newcomers but didn't move aside. Jake, Carol called out, I brought some official help to sort this out. Deputy Rodriguez surveyed the scene with professional calm. Mr. Sullivan, I understand there's been a dispute about property access. Deputy, Jake replied, these folks broke into my barn and are conducting unauthorized meetings on my property. The bulls don't appreciate uninvited guests. The deputy walked carefully around Thunder, who allowed the passage but continued blocking the exit for everyone else. After hearing statements from both sides and examining the cut padlock, Deputy Rodriguez delivered his verdict. Mrs. Blackwood, cutting someone's lock and entering their property without permission constitutes criminal trespass. Mr. Sullivan, your bulls are on your property behaving naturally, so there's no issue with their presence. He turned to address the trapped HOA members. Folks, you're going to need to work this out with Mr. Sullivan and his livestock. I can't force the bulls to move, and they have every right to be in their own barn. The final negotiation took place with Thunder serving as an imposing mediator. Patricia agreed to drop all HOA actions against Jake's barn and to respect his agricultural rights. The county consultant withdrew from the project entirely. Dennis and Barbara promised to focus their community improvement efforts on properties where they were actually welcome. As the agreements were reached, Thunder seemed to sense the resolution and slowly moved away from the door. The HOA members filed out with considerably less confidence than they'd arrived with. Their community takeover plans thoroughly defeated by 3 bulls and 1 determined rancher. 6 months later, Jake's barn remains exactly where it's always been, housing Thunder, Maverick, and Beast in the comfort they deserve. The HOA has found other projects to occupy their time, and Jake's property rights are more secure than ever. Sometimes the best way to deal with bullies is to introduce them to actual bulls. What's the most creative way you've ever seen someone defend their property rights? And do you think Jake's solution was fair given the circumstances?